everyone, it's Alice, and today we're gonna do one of my favorite videos to make. I make one of these every year. I love watching everyone else's as well, and it is, of course, time to talk about the very best books that I read in 2022. Now, this year is going to be a little bit different because I read less last year than I usually do. I read 42 books, and only 3 of those books I gave 5 stars, and obviously they're going to be included today, but I also somehow read a lot of 4-star reads, and some of those 4-star reads are some of my favorite books that I read last year, so I'm gonna include some of those as well. Usually I don't separate my favorites into categories, but I am gonna do that this time. So we're gonna have the good, the great, and the best. And we're just gonna do that because that's what makes most sense to me in my brain. We're gonna start with the good, of which I have 4, and it's a real mishmash of books. The first one that I have is actually a reread, and usually I don't include rereads in these types of like favorites videos or on my favorite lists, but it's been over a decade since I read this book for the first time, maybe even a little bit longer, so I'm allowing myself to include it because it kind of did feel like reading it for the first time. It is Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. Now, I'm aware that some people really don't like this author's books, but I just do. It's not a literary masterpiece, I know, but it's so much fun. This is the first book in the Robert Langdon series, and he is like a professor of symbology. And in this book, he is called over to Europe to figure out this cryptic symbol, and this leads him to go on this roaring adventure. We've got secret societies, loads of history and science and religion, and so many great settings, and for someone like me who loves an adventure story, this is just perfect. I honestly think that the story in here is really cool, and it's really compulsive and sucks you in, and the twist at the end, it's amazing. If you're the kind of reader who is looking for a book to just like gush over the writing in, and you're not quite able to like look away from the fact that some things are a little bit convenient, some things are a little bit far-fetched, this isn't the book for you. But if you love a good adventure mixed with like a mystery, this is just fantastic, and it's so entertaining. It's just a great break from reality, and it's just so much fun. The second book I've got is perhaps less fun, but it is very interesting, and I've thought a lot about this book since I finished it. It's The 7 Ages of Death by Richard Shepard, and this is a nonfiction book. It's one of 2 nonfiction books that has made it to my favorites list this year, and the author of this is a forensic pathologist, so he works with autopsies and trying to figure out how people have died, and this takes a look at some of the cases that he has worked on, and the book sort of splits a human life into 7 different parts or 7 different ages and takes a look at each of them. This is my second book by this author, and there's just something about the way that the facts and the science, but also the stories of these people, the way it's presented just works really well for me. I do have an interest in these types of topics, which obviously helps, but I just thought it was fascinating, if also somewhat worrying. I think there's something about the mix of like science and memoir that works really well for me, and I really like the tone of like how those books are often written, and I think it's, for me, a great way of like learning about a particular field, but there's also like personal stories, which just makes it easier for me to digest, I guess. I will say this book is not for everyone. Obviously, large parts of this book deal with dead people, and like I mentioned, it deals with all stages of life, which includes the very, very young, and that's like at the beginning of the book, and that's difficult to read, obviously, but for me, it was worth it. The thing that has really stuck with me about this book is the last part, actually, when the author talks about old age and how he has reached old age and what that's like for him. Like, that's the part that's really stuck with me, and I felt like it was dealt with very well. Then we have got this wonderful book. This is The Appeal by Janice Hallett, and I got this book off BookTube actually, and I'm so glad I found it. It's an epistolary mystery, so the entire thing is written in like correspondence, which in this case is like texts and emails and I think maybe a couple of letters and like notes and stuff. The story is structured in a way where two lawyers are sent all of this correspondence, and they're sort of tasked with trying to figure out who has committed this murder. There is a lot going on in this book. There's like a theater group and a theater production, and there's a fundraiser for the sick child, and there's a lot of people in it and a lot going on, and there's a murder and someone has been arrested for it, but is it the right person? I think the storytelling in here is a little unique and very engaging, and I wish that there were more books out there like this, so if anyone knows of any, do let me know. It is a little bit slow in parts, and there are a lot of characters in here, like a lot of them, and it can be a little bit confusing at first, but I had a lot of fun with this book, and it's perfect if you like a whodunit and you want to read a mystery in a slightly different format. Lastly, for this category, we have one of the classics that I read last year. It was Emma by Jane Austen, which is obviously very well known. It's an Austen novel, but this was my first read of it and I really enjoyed it. I think the thing that has really stuck with me from this book is Emma, the main character. There's just something about her that I think is very interesting. She's not always that likable, which is probably what makes her so interesting, and there's just something about her that has stuck with me in my mind. And there are several scenes in here that I keep thinking about. They just like pop up in my head and I think about them. And I'm actually a little bit surprised by how much I've thought about this book since I finished it, because when I finished it, I didn't think that that was going to be the case. Pride and Prejudice is still my favorite Jane Austen, but this is definitely up there. My biggest complaint that I had with this book is that it's very, very slow towards the middle. It is a little bit slow overall, but there's like a part in here that is just so slow, and I really, really struggled through it. But the rest of it was excellent, and this is definitely a book that I think I want to reread in a couple of years, and I might get on with it even better. Then moving on to the greats, of which I also have 4 books. First, I have the second nonfiction book that appears on this list. It is All That Remains by Sue Black, which is another death book, which you won't be surprised by if you spend a lot of time on this channel. I love a good book about death, and this is a great one. Black is a forensic anthropologist and an expert in anatomy, and her work is all with mortal remains, whether they're in her lab, at the scene of a crime, at the scene of a natural disaster, in a war zone, like anywhere you can find dead people, she works. And the book is all about different cases that she's worked on, and it's also about how the forensic field, like the forensic science field, has developed since she started and everything that they can do. Again, I just love the mix between science and memoir, and Black writes in a way that is just, it's so good. She is so intelligent, but she also has this like wisdom and peace about her, and the way that she explains everything. It just feels like this really wise person is taking you on this journey through some really disturbing stuff sometimes, yes, but there is like a peace to it that I just think is incredible. Again, if you don't like reading about dead people and bones, this is not for you, but if you're like me and you're interested in it, this is fantastic. Next, we have got a book that I'm so happy I finally got around to reading after having had it on my shelves for years. It is, of course, If We Were Villains by Emma Rio. And this is one of the quintessential dark academia books, and it's about a group of university students at this elite college who basically end up in their very own Shakespearean drama. There are so many things about this book that I just loved. I think the setting is amazing. I love this school and how strange it is, and like it's very elite, but it also has like a cult-like feeling to it, which I think is very interesting. And I loved seeing these characters at this school, and it really feels like they live in like a vacuum. They live in a bubble, and everything that happens in the book sort of happens because they live in such an isolated way. There's a lot of great tension in this book, and there's a lot of tension within this group, which I thought was really interesting. There are 7 people in the friend group, so there's a lot of characters in here, and not all of them are super well explored, but I really liked reading about them and their different dynamics, and there's just something about these kinds of stories that really appeal to me. The only reason I didn't give it 5 stars It's kind of like a dumb reason, but I couldn't help myself. The Secret History, as you know, is one of my favorite books, and I could not help but compare this to that as I was reading. And I know I shouldn't have done that, but like I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help myself but compare a little bit. I've said this before and I stand by it. I feel like this book is like The Secret History light, and I mean that in the best way. Like, if you don't get on with The Secret History and maybe you find the writing too descriptive or too pretentious or whatever, this is a fantastic alternative. It deals with some of the same themes and explores, like, it has some of the same vibe. If you like dark academia though, this is definitely a must read, and I totally get why everyone told me I needed to read this, because it's really, really good. Then I read another book that I had had on my shelves for a really long time. It was Stoner by John Williams. And this is also a classic, and we follow this man who is born into a poor farming family, but he gets the opportunity to go to university to study agriculture. But when he's there, he discovers his love of literature, and he changes his major and he chooses a scholar's life for himself. And we basically just follow him throughout his entire life. This book really is just about the quiet and sometimes devastating and disappointing life of this man. And I had a really good feeling about this book. Like, I thought I was gonna love it. And although it took me a few tries to get into, like, I had to start this book 3 times before I could really get into it, which is very rare for me. I just had a good feeling about it, and so I kept going, and I'm really glad I did. This book took me on like a journey, and it took me in different directions than I had really expected. I ended up just loving following the main character and getting to know him. I think this book is a great example of capturing a character's inner life really, really well. But we also see that this inner life doesn't translate to his outside world, so not like the people around him don't get to see what we get to see about him, which I thought was very interesting. And I think this captures a lot of things about the human experience that I think a lot of people can relate to. It is a slower book, and it's character driven, and not a lot happens in it really. And I think these kinds of stories require really, really good writing, and this has that, which is what makes it so good. I don't know who I would recommend this book to though. Like, I don't really know, but I feel like if you think you'll like this book, you probably will. Like, the people who this book is for, they'll know. Lastly, in the good category, before we move on to the very, very best, we have These Violent Delights by Micah Nemariver. This is set in the 1970s, and it's about these two people who meet and are just immediately drawn to each other. They meet at school, and they just see something in each other and recognize something in each other that just brings them together. And the story is about their friendship, which eventually evolves into something more, and it evolves into something volatile and obsessive and almost overpowering. This is one of those books that when I started reading it, and I was like maybe a few chapters in, I just knew that I'd found a good book, which is like the best feeling. The story is about this relationship, yes, but it is also a sort of like coming of age story, and it's about people who feel like outsiders who find each other, which I think is very interesting. And there's so much tension in this book, and it does have an obsessive like feeling to it, and it just gets more and more obsessive and darker and more twisted. For me, I felt like this book sort of allowed me to look at something that I'm not supposed to get to look at, which I think is a fantastic thing to find in books. I've heard this described as like a mix between The Secret History and Call Me By Your Name, and I think that's pretty accurate, especially when it comes to just like the vibe and the feeling of this book. And so if you like those kinds of books, I think you would really like this. I do think it's the kind of book that's not for everyone though, so you kind of just have to figure out if it's for you. Then we have finally made it to the very best of the best. These are the 3 books that I gave 5 stars to in 2022. And it's a little bit of an interesting mix. The first book that I gave 5 stars to is the book that started my love affair with Maggie O'Farrell, It's Hamnet, which is a historical fiction novel set in England in, I think it starts off in like 1596 or something like that. And it's basically a fictionalized account of one of Shakespeare's sons who died at age 11. That Shakespeare stuff is like kind of less important in the story than you would think, but it is there and it's interesting. But the story is like, Shakespeare is never named in the story, and it focuses mostly on his wife, Agnes, who is considered to be a little bit of a witch. But they fall in love, they have a family, and it's about their lives and this tragedy that comes to them. Again, this is the kind of book where I was on the first page of this and I was like, oh my god, this writing. And I know this writing is not the kind of writing that fits everyone, but it's my perfect kind of like writing and storytelling, and it's just so good. I love the way the characters are drawn up. They feel like real people, and again, they have really rich inner lives, and you get to see all of it, and you just understand them even if you don't agree with them. And there's like, it explores the different dynamics within the family, and it's just so good. The setting, everything is good. It is a little bit slow, but for me this was like the perfect kind of slowness. I think this story just required that, and you know that feeling, like I got the feeling when I read this book where I just felt like I had found the perfect book. I thought the story was really engaging. It is definitely character driven, and again, I know this kind of writing is not for everyone. Some people find this kind of stuff too descriptive and too flowery and not enough happens in the story, and I totally get that. So I know that this book is not for everyone, but for the people it's for, you're gonna love it so much. I feel like this is kind of like with the writing in The Secret History, like some people love it like me, and then there are people who just absolutely loathe it, and I understand, but if you're the kind of person who likes this kind of writing and this kind of storytelling, oh my god, this is just perfect. Highly, highly recommend. Then we have got this book, which I have like a weirdly small copy of. I really want to get like another copy of this because it's like very small, but I can assure you the contents are great. This is, of course, Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, and this is an urban fantasy novel, and it's about this, like, we follow this main character who is given a place at Yale, despite the fact that she has like dropped out of high school, she never finished it, and she has lived kind of like a rough life, but she's given this place at Yale in return for her doing a particular job, which involves monitoring like the secret societies of Yale. And she's being trained by this guy who has had this job for the past 3 years, but then as we go on, we realize there's a lot of dark stuff going on, and then this guy goes missing, and we're basically just trying to figure it all out. Now, this is certainly not a book for everyone. I know some people just really, really do not get on with this, but I just loved it. There's something about this that just sucked me right in, and this story has so many elements to it that I just absolutely love. I love the setting. Again, it has great dark academia vibes. I love all of that. I love the secret societies and the magic and all of that. I just loved reading about all of it. I also really liked our main character. Like, in the beginning I was a little bit iffy about her, but she's kind of unlikable, which I like. Like, I like reading about unlikable characters, and she really grew on me as we went. And I think that she has a really interesting perspective on everything that's going around her, because she is so different from all of these people who she's around. And I think that adds a really interesting perspective on this book, and there's like some critique in here that I think is really interesting, and it's just so dark, and I just loved it. I definitely think that this book is worth a go if you like these kinds of books. I think the thing that loses people with this, and I've heard this from several people, is that it's kind of slow in the beginning. Like, the first 100 pages are a little bit slow, it's a little bit dense, and apparently some people have like a hard time getting into it. I didn't really struggle with that, so I don't know if that's just me, but I kind of like slow and dense books when it comes to these kinds of stories. I feel like it's worth getting past those like 100 pages and getting to like the really, really good part. And I don't know. There's something about this that I just absolutely love, and I just thought it was so good. Now, we're gonna end this video on the sweetest of sweetest books, which I think is kind of funny because I read all of these serious books all the time and it's dark and twisted, and then I read this book and I just had to give it 5 stars because it is the most adorable thing. It's Garlic and the Vampire by Brie Paulson, which is a graphic novel about this garlic person who lives in a village of vegetable folk, and they are like friends with a witch named Agnes, and what happens in this book is that a vampire moves into the neighborhood, which freaks everyone out. And because Garlic is garlic, they want to send her to confront this vampire. But she is she's a very anxious person, and so she doesn't really want to go. But she ends up going, and that's the story. Look, you gotta take this book for what it is, which is what I did. It is a simple but wonderful story about friendship and bravery, and it's about going on adventures and discovering things about yourself. It is very predictable. Like, I don't think this book is gonna surprise you in any way, really, except with the fact that it's just absolutely adorable. And this book just gave me such a good feeling, and it put me in such a good mood. The art in here is also amazing. It's very autumnal. I read this in fall and it was perfect for that, like the color palette. And I think the art in here is really, really good. I think the characters' expressions in particular, especially with the garlic person, I think the way it's captured really adds a lot to the story, and it's just an adorable and wonderful book, and it's perfect if you just like need a break from everything and you need something feel good. It'll take you like half an hour to read, and it's the perfect break from just everything. That concludes my favorite books that I read in 2022 though. Now, I would love to know what your favorite books from last year was. Like, tell me all about it in the comments. I can't wait to read about it. And as always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!